Hi, welcome back to the podcast. So I'm here with my friend Adam Lawrence. Adam, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you, Paul. I'm very well. Thanks for having me again.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. It seems that since the last time we've spoken, a lot has changed. Yet another prime minister. How many will we have before Christmas? Just by way to people listening to the podcast, this is unusually we return to a format which I really like and which perhaps we've done more of, which is the fireside chat. So this is actually being recorded in front of a live audience. I just provide that for context. So, Adam, here we are. Adam, Andy Burnham, now in office, new Prime Minister. Give us your sort of first reactions.
Well, obviously we had there's been a lot of chat about, 7th PM in 10 years and things like that. Probably more relevant to us is like sixth chancellor within 4 years, I think it is. So that's a probably fair bit more worrying given where we're at. It seems that the way that Burnham has slotted in is what they're calling the soft left,
Mhm.
which is probably there to keep the more traditional Labour voter happy. Although I'm not so sure the traditional Labour voter votes Labour anymore, which is part of their problem, I suppose. Um, so some chat about socialism, some chat about what he hasn't done in Manchester, what he did and didn't achieve, sort of thing. Seems quite idealistic. Very, very clearly strikes a much clearer tone than Starmer, but this is a very low bar to beat, really, Paul, isn't it? Let's face it. Um, does seem to be able to gauge the mood of the nation and come out and talk on the right topics at the right time. So I've been, look, I'm an optimist, Paul. We talked about, I think last time we spoke, I described myself as annoyingly optimistic. And that probably comes and sets through into the political arena as well, because I personally feel that's the only way to approach things. Otherwise, you want to be a cynic and know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I don't think we do really. So we are where we are. We can't control the political landscape. But clearly, he's put housing right at the top of the agenda. Obviously, restoring Rayner after her small omission of that 40 grand that she owed HMRC. And also bringing Matthew Pennycook, bringing the position into attending cabinet. So not making him a full Secretary of State, but the housing minister will now attend cabinet. That's probably sending the right sort of message. And his chatter that's been relevant to us so far has been around things like rent controls, but also arguably around the idea of putting the personal allowance up rather than, because let's not forget, it's 2026 and at the moment it's frozen until 2031. And it's all very well doing that in front of a spreadsheet. But I think what he's certainly trying to show with his cutting of VAT on the electricity bills, although that's temporary, with the freezing of the bus fares, ago again, that's temporary, all quite clever trickery from an accounting perspective, because if it's temporary, we don't have to put it in the permanent figures. Local authorities do that stuff all the time. But it's clear messaging about, I do understand and I do care about the people that are suffering. There is, as much as you can believe it, in a Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, 7.4 million people who can't afford the essentials in this country. I'm struggling with that number, Paul, if I'm honest with you. And I probably am closer to that side of things than many people, because I have some portfolios of property in some really quite poor areas and have intel on the ground and first-hand experience as well. So it depends what you mean by afford, and it depends what you mean by essentials, is what this nasty capitalist would say. Because 7.4 million does sound like an awful lot. But I think he's definitely got his messaging down. He has a clear idea of what he wants to do. I'm not sure about his mathematical prowess and his budgeting at the moment, because we've already seen a little row back on that personal allowance statement, because someone's kind of pointed out, well, Andy, for every pound we do it by, it costs us XX million quid. What do you think now? Oh, okay, that's quite a lot, isn't it? And we need to get it from somewhere. So, not overly worried in the same way that would have been had a Jeremy Corbyn been at the helm. That was probably self-evident. A bit clearer on what his vision is than Starmer, but as I say, clearer than mud, so big deal, sort of thing. Um, and what will the speculation be like? I'm really interested, Paul, in how well he's controlled the narrative. John Healey as Chancellor is a great example. The last government was leakier than a colander, let's face it, but he managed to keep that appointment really tight. People thought it was going to be Streeting, then they thought it was going to be Miliband, then they thought it was going to be Mahmood, and she was described as nailed on in the FT. And it's not usual for the FT to get too many things wrong. And then we went on to our the fourth appointment before we'd even started, who probably of the candidates in terms of experience, in terms of thinking about managing the bond markets, was the best choice.
Mhm. Well, I mean, there's much to have a go at there, but like if we pick up on that last thread of so we hear a lot about bond yields, and I'm not convinced that as like investors or particularly the general public have really any concept of really what that means. So if we were to look at 10-year and 30-year bond years, like they are right at the top. So clearly they're getting a bid. That's true, I think, for most countries around the world right now, but we seem to be far ahead of it, or we seem to be one of the worst. Just, I'm going to ask you to do the impossible, Adam. In a sentence, explain the relevance of bond yields for government and us as taxpayers, and then specifically the relevance of them in terms of investors, property investors, and what impact how they feed into mortgage rates.
Well, I'm going to plead bargain for two sentences, one for government and
Yeah,
individuals and
how
one for
about it?
property investors, if that's okay. So in terms of government and personal situations, the analogy that runs across the property piece is the bath, right? So there's a lot of water in the bath already. That's the money we've already borrowed, and we're paying a rate of interest on that. The rough stock of debt we're paying about 3.4% on at the moment. The bond yield is the new water into the bath. What temperature is that coming in at? It's coming in a bit colder or a bit hotter, depending on how you like your baths, right? But it's coming in at about 5% on the 10-year, right? So we're at an average of 3.4. These bonds mature at different times, but a good at least 6% of it drops off every year, right? And that has to be filled with new. So average of 3.4 is running out. Actually, what's running out is probably at a lower rate than 3.4, and it's being refilled and topped up a bit at 5%. So what does that mean? It's interest that we've got to find, even if we find it by borrowing it, which Paul we often do. But at sort of 3.3, 3.4, that's not a lot different from where inflation has been over the last 12 months. So inflation eats that away, realistically. At 5%, it's obviously well above inflation. And that's a real bite into the real budget of the government of the United Kingdom. What does that mean? They either need to tax us more or they need to spend less on public services, or a mixture of both, of course, right? From a property investor perspective, it sets the frame for what we're going to pay on our mortgage rates. So very simply, if we're looking at a 5-year fix, that at the moment is about 4.5% on the bond yield. It's that competitive in the broader banking market that that's effectively what you pay on your mortgage. If you're a good borrower, maybe only borrowing 60% loan to value, you'll be at the bond yield because the big banks have got so much money to lend and they want these mortgages because it might mean they get the rest of your banking, they get your credit cards, they get your personal loans, they get the bits that they actually do make a profit on. So they don't make a lot on mortgages or anything at all, really. They make money when you drop off your fixed rate if you haven't refixed it. So they're kind of buying that business in. So that is going to set, with no premium, roughly what you'll pay on your own personal residential mortgage, with about 1% premium what you'll pay on a personally owned buy-to-let mortgage, and with about a 2% premium what you'll pay on a limited company mortgage.
Mhm.
That's as simple as I can. There's some simplifications in there, and some people might criticize that because that's not 100% accurate. That's the best I can do in two sentences. And they were two very long sentences anyway. I appreciate that.
No, they were excellent. And so then, I suppose, putting you on the spot even further, with the all things remaining equal on the limited information that we have so far, like where do you see that going over let, so when do we think we'll have an election? 28, 29?
Well, 29, July, technically August 29 would be the latest point at which we could have one
Okay.
under the law. Um, when do we think we'll have one? Without going off on a huge tangent on that one, I think there's a strong chance he might call an election pretty quickly, Paul, actually. Um, Whether that's for mandate reasons and moving too far away from the manifesto, and or because this is a good time to strike. Farage is on his uppers at the moment.
Mhm.
Badenoch isn't really ready.
Mhm.
Restore Britain, who are going to be a problem at some point, are not going to be organised enough. Zach Polanski has kind of faded away a bit into the background. This is the chance. He's not going to be as popular as he is today. He will have been told that by his special advisors, Paul.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like reasonably kind of well established, isn't it, that people get a honeymoon period. You know, there is this excitement, there is this optimism, that there is that, this is the person who will, will change things. And then people get this honeymoon period. And as you say, like Keir Starmer made nothing of his honeymoon period. Like he kind of wrecked it that first interview in the Garden, where he basically said everything's going to get worse before it gets better. Um, well, that's fascinating in the absence of, a snap election based on the fact that it's a tactically sensible thing for him to do, if it does go the duration into 2028, 2029, what do you think, what does your crystal ball say in terms of mortgage rates and lending rates going into the next 2 to 3 years? Because everybody listening to this podcast will have either a personal mortgage or a buy-to-let mortgage, or their kids, they'll be thinking about their kids buying their first homes, and they'll be thinking about where mortgage rates are going.
Yes, stubbornly sluggish, I think, Paul, is fair. But what I would say to people is, we use 5-year financing almost exclusively. And there's two real reasons for that. One, we do a lot of small individual property loans, right? So there's a lot of admin involved, and the legal fees make up a decent percentage of the loan. They probably add about 1.5% to our average loan, right? So that's an extra arrangement fee in many ways, right? So that's one thing that we factor in. We wouldn't want to do that every 2 years because it would be too expensive, right? And then the administration has to be done by someone. There's a resource commitment there, right? It also helps with smoothing out over the longer term. So we don't have a drop off at any one. We don't have a year or a quarter or a month where we suddenly go, oh my goodness, 30% of our debt has dropped off. And we're talking across a portfolio of hundreds of properties, as you know. So it's a strategic play. But at this time, I probably feel more sympathetic to anyone who wants to take either a 2-year product or a variable rate product than I would normally do, right? Because I think there's downside to come. I don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East, but my bet here, and it is a bet, would be that Mr. Trump has got to do something much more permanent before the midterm elections, because I don't think this is helping. Oil back over 100 a barrel. It hurts his voter base if gas is more expensive than it needs to be, as they
Mhm.
call it over in the States, right? And the reality of the price spikes in oil since the February the 28th has ultimately hit people in the pocket through food and things like that, but it hasn't hit them on the central heating yet, Paul. And we know that's more of a European problem than an American problem, although there are
Mhm.
obviously parts of the States where it bites quite a lot. But that will start to be much more on the agenda 1st of October sort of time. So I think there's big pressure to get something wrapped up by the end of September, which would see oil come back down again, which would see inflation start to calm a little bit again, which would see us back to that annoyingly slow pathway of steadily reducing rates. Because it's probably fair to say that then again, you use that famous economist phrase, all else being equal, that never actually happens in the real world. But we probably are in a world where about 3 to 3.5% is an acceptable base rate, is kind of where, if you ask the government today, where would they like to be? I think they'd say about 3% would be a fair reflection. You can't go too low because otherwise the bond yields will climb because all the investors will go, well, you're not controlling inflation. So if inflation is high, the bond yields have to be higher to compensate me for all that inflation that you're not controlling. This is why it's such a fine, balanced game being on the monetary policy committee, or the game that the Bank of England have to play. So I think, what's our worst case normal scenario? Dealing with mortgages at about 6.5% for limited company investors. Stress test 7.5%, but that really is stress. And remember, if you have fixed and you haven't got commercial loans with nasty terms in them, you have fixed, right? So you know where you are. And this is one of the reasons why I use that sort of smoothing technique across the portfolio to make sure, ideally, no more than 25% of our debt will drop off in any 1 year.
Cool. That definitely makes sense. What is that? You studied economics, as did I, but I have now completely forgotten. There's that. What was the Latin expression of all things being equal that they used to like?
Ceteris paribus, it's called. Yeah.
I remember having that repeated at me ad nauseum for forever and ever and ever. Okay, so if we stick with continue with the property centric stuff before more like helicoptering out. So Andy Burnham is known for and I'm going to be as like neutral in all things. He has a good reputation in Manchester. Manchester is a city that has done well. I say that as one of us, Andy Burnham or I, is on the wrong side of the Pennines. There's a healthy rivalry there. But Manchester is a great success story of the North. It definitely is. And as somebody who lives in Yorkshire and looks at how Leeds has fared, there's many a conversation had over dinner of what has Manchester done that Leeds hasn't, in terms of its growth. He has a reputation for an interest in housing. He has a reputation for the kind of intervention in the housing market in terms of rental standards and that kind of thing. We're currently going through, well, like Leeds and so many cities are going through selective licensing and various challenges around that. Highly unpopular, as you would imagine, in the landlord community. What do you think specifically his arrival means for the private rental sector?
Well, he's got a fairly idealistic, and I agree with being as neutral as possible. I think he's fairly idealistic around housing, although not often quoted. He's a landlord himself, Paul, as well.
Right.
But he ideologically seems to believe if you provide poor standard accommodation, it should be taken off you, right? So he wants stronger compulsory purchase powers, is one of the things that he's already talked about. Now, there's a huge elephant in the room there, Paul, and that is that when we look at the studies that are done on a meta basis, ultimately, social housing is lower standard than private rental sector housing. So the idea of compulsory purchasing a private sector home to bring it into a social sector that underperforms on that basis is difficult. And how do you enforce against local authorities? How are you going to punish them if they're delivering damp and moldy properties? We all know local authorities break the law every day in reality when it comes to housing and a number of other things. Even though there's statutory requirements, they don't fulfill their statutory requirements. We could defend them by saying it's a budgetary problem, but it's not all about the money, of course. So he seems to be quite idealistic around that. And this Labour Party, remember, has reduced the amount of children in B&Bs in temporary accommodation, for example. I think that's to be praised, right? That's the idealistic part of what they went after with the temporary accommodation. What they didn't mention last year is temporary accommodation still grew by 8%. One of the very first things he did was dedicate, I think, was it 345 million to rough sleeping and things like that. we all know I'm not against putting money into rough sleeping, but to think that it's a money problem to solve rough sleeping is a bit of a joke, really, because we all know it's extremely complex and
Mhm.
a lot of rough sleeping. Very many people are offering rough sleepers places to stay every night, and they're not taking it up for a variety of reasons. So we need more than money to intervene in that problem. It doesn't mean money's not going to do anything, of course, but it's all quite ideological and idealistic. And I think reality bite when it comes to housing, if you want, he talked about council housing, didn't he? Actually use the words council housing, which haven't been used for years at the top level of politics because it was deemed to be a stigma or whatever. I think it's good to have it on the agenda, but again, someone will show him a report, and it's one of those very rare moments where Shelter agree with Granger and everybody in between, right? That we need 90 to 100,000 new council homes a year for at least a decade to put a dent in the social housing waiting list. And to put that into context, last year we delivered 13,000 and we knocked down 15,000. So we net lost stock before we consider right to buy. Paul.
Mhm.
So which actually meant about another 4,000 walked out the door as it went. But so not a huge loss, but we're not even contributing net units to social at the moment. Social homes, interesting enough, when it comes to the government papers, are discounted over the lifespan of, I can't remember if it's 40 or 50 years, and then deemed to be worth nothing after 40 or 50 years, which is ridiculous, really. And it's actually a good reason for keeping right to buy in place, but changing the parameters of it. But if he did this biggest council house building program since the war, would only really see him need to deliver about 20,000 a year, right?
Mhm.
And it can be done. You know, there are people, Darren Rodwell, who was the Labour leader of the Barking and Dagenham Council, had some brilliant initiatives when he was the leader. And I was so disappointed to see him not elected in 2024, which obviously was the best chance for anyone Labour to get elected for at least a generation. You know, stopped by nefarious factor. I don't want to go full conspiracy theory, Paul, but he is a man. He's written a book on it about his community rent model. It's called Building Homes and Communities or something like that. But it doesn't sound the most exciting, but it's a brilliant book, right? He really goes into it, and he's done. It's not theory. He's done these things. They built in Barking and Dagenham 20% of London's social homes in 1 year, right? And then bear in mind there's 32 boroughs, and Barking and Dagenham is not famous for being well capitalised, right? Definitely famous for needing social homes, but it did a magnificent job. And that stuff needs importing all the way up to the Westminster level, in my
Mhm.
opinion. But what I'm sure you start the job with all the best intentions and the best but ideology usually fails, Paul. It usually leads to bad outcomes. We have to
Mhm.
live in the real world. And what extra funding will there be? Remember, we've got 39 billion set aside for social and affordable. That's part of the problem. The scope is too broad. Over
Mhm.
the next decade, that would build about 18,000 social homes a year, right? Which would get him to his target. So the kind of stuff is in place for it
Mhm.
to be done. It just needs delivering. But 18,000 is not 90 to 100,000, obviously.
Definitely. And you make a very interesting point about ideology. In the last 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, I've seen headlines on both sides around rent control. So at one point, it looked like he was going to come out of the gate and that was going to be part of the conversation. And then the last headline I've read, which might have obviously changed by this morning, I haven't checked, that rent controls were very much off the table. So, you've done some great work on this. So give us some thoughts around, what was the impact of rent controls in Scotland? Um, and where do you see Andy Burnham's current direction of travel on rent controls?
So there's a magnificent meta study on this, Paul, where I think he considers 50 or 100 studies on rent control and brings them all together. Uh, I'm going to butcher his name, so I apologise in advance. Kobadashvili, I believe, is the author of that report. So that's the comprehensive work on rent control. And guess what? It shows it broadly doesn't work very well. I
Mhm.
think I'd rather characterise it these days as it can work for tenants who are already in tenancies in
Mhm.
situ. So at this time it works. It's a very temporary panacea. In for future renters, it absolutely screws them over, to give it the technical term. So Scotland, a brilliant example, as you've said, they legislated for a rent cap. First mistake, not thinking about the language, right? I think in England they would think a lot more about the language of this, but then they legislated the cap as an emergency at 0%. And that's what caused the big problem. So to be clear, they controlled existing rents, but they didn't control new rents. So over the course of that 12 months, new rents in Scotland went up 14-15%, because people said, well, if rent control is going to be there on the way and I need to go high. And some people, some landlords actively, they just kept properties off the market, Paul. They kept them empty, or they went to short let or other alternatives that obviously exist. New supply dried up. And eventually, when they lifted the cap at 0%, the law then said 3% is the cap for everyone, 6% if you can prove your costs have gone up. So if you remember 2023, everybody's costs have gone up because there was huge levels of inflation, double-digit levels of inflation. And so everybody could prove a 6% increase. So every tenant who many landlords would have left alone in the past had a 6% rent increase in the time of rent control. It just didn't help. Even if we say, forget us lot, forget the institutions, forget the investors, let them eat cake, whatever, let's just focus on the tenant. The tenant outcomes have been really poor from that, Paul. So how can we possibly have rent controls as a good idea on the agenda? So they sound lovely, ideologically very good, but in practice, they just work against what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, you would have come across this probably as much as I have. I've sat around kind of mastermind tables with landlords who've kind of been in the business for a while. And a really interesting, and I think this feeds into rent controls, is you'll have a really well-meaning landlord or landlady who, is doing their best, and they appreciate that one of their tenants is struggling a little bit, and so they do this thing of like a little bit like care in the community. They don't give them a rent increase for a long time, and it turns into a decade. But then the problem is that the property, it's really difficult to keep the property to a really good standard, because there's this whole conversation of like, I'm not making any money whatsoever from you as a tenant, and I can live with that. But what I can't do is start, doing a complete refurbishment of this property, because I just don't have the cash in the bank account. And obviously around the table, like everybody's saying, look, that just doesn't work as a model, because it's an obligation to keep up with the repairs and maintenance. But to do that, you need to be a cash flow positive business, don't you? And I think that's the challenge with rent controls, is if they come down like a guillotine, and over time, like the asset is not cash flow positive, how can the landlord do their responsibilities and take care of it? It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Well, we can go back, right? I mean, Scotland example is very good. Obviously, 2022, 2023, go back to the 70s and the Rent Act, right? We know what happened. And exactly what you've just said is what played out, and what plays out with regulated tenancies, right? They obviously still exist. So we can still see the skeletons of what happens. And ultimately, when those assets trade, if you send a RICS valuer to one, the average dart they're going to throw is 50% of the vacant possession value. And if you look at the price they trade at auction, on average, it's about 30 to 35% of the vacant possession value of the property. So destroys an incredible amount of value, which, of course, the left might say, well, jolly good, take it off the evil capitalist pig dogs or whatever. But ultimately, it stops people from supplying new units because they just put their money somewhere else. We just said earlier on, Paul, you can lend it to the government at 5%. So why would you go through the hassle if you're going to get your rent capped? Now, I think what we need to be clear on is, if we saw an inflation-linked cap, which I think is much more likely, right? The sanguine likes of myself would say, well, that's okay. I don't have a lot of rents that are adrift, right? So I'm okay with that. And actually, the bigger you get, the more institutional you get, they'd be delighted with inflation. If we look at the 2005, which is the first year the ONS has data for, the rents from '05 to today, they haven't kept pace with inflation. They've gone up less than inflation. So again, the tenant will be the one that's worse off. But you know where you are as an institution. You've got an index linked asset. You're quite happy with it. But of course, what that would do is it would create some stranded assets, Paul, because if you are that landlord that you've just described, who are basically now going to be penalised for your kindness, and then you say, well, this is terrible because I don't want to evict the tenant, but they're paying 700 quid in a property that should be 1,500 quid. I can't bring myself to do that. I know what, I'll auction it. And if everybody then knows, well, I can't take the 700 and make it 1,200 or do the necessary works or whatever, I'm not going to be able to move the tenant on. Well, it makes the asset worth again. You're going to go into that sort of black hole between the value of a regulated tenancy at auction and what used to be a tenanted property at auction, which already traded at a bit of a discount. And you're going to send the price of those assets down to 55, 60p in the pound. Incredible value destruction. And then, of course, the people who still buy them will still then evict the tenants and resell them, because that will be the only angle commercially to make money out of them. And there are people out there who will do that.
Mm-hmm. Continue with the property just sort of specific points just for a moment longer before we kind of expand the conversation a little bit further. So there's been talk of, wealth tax changes to, but also, changes to the way that the property is taxed as well. In particular, looking at council tax, looking at stamp duty, looking at, a land value tax. So what do you think his current position is on that, and where do you see that theme developing?
Well, little bit of history first when we talk land value tax, if we start there. We have tried to implement it twice, albeit one time over 100 years ago and one time about 90 years ago. But we've given up the ghost on it, Paul, both times because it was too hard to value everything. It would be a hell of a time to introduce a strictly termed land value tax, because like my portfolio, for example, the insurance rebuild value is about 60% above what the actual value is of those properties, right? So in theory, if they did a land value tax positive or negative, I'd be getting paid for the portfolio that I hold, right? Because you're talking nowadays, rebuild on a 2-bed mid terrace, it's going to be a 200 grand minimum, right? On a valuation report. And there's lots of England and Wales where that's not the sort of value we're talking about, right? So we've definitely got to bear that in mind. So strict land value tax, I just think no chance in the world. You would get certain bits in Kensington or whatever you want to pick where the cost would be going from £2,000 a year to £12,000 a year. And we're not talking like multi-millionaires who are going to have to find that extra 10 grand. It just doesn't work. A property tax, which obviously they use in the United States, for example, much more likely. So we're just talking about the value of the property rather than the value of the land. Maybe it could happen, but it's a huge transition. And you'd have to think about relief for example, if there are two houses that are both worth 200k, and I bought one yesterday and paid £10,000 worth of SDLT on it, and you bought yours 30 years ago and you didn't pay any SDLT on it because you bought it for a fiver or whatever. Should I have some transitional relief against that tax? What plugs that gap? Resi stamp duty brings in about 12 billion a year. So it's not small money, not huge, but no taxes bring in big money apart from income taxes and consumption taxes and a bit of corporation tax. So we spend 95% of our time talking about the satellite taxes that represent about 20%, 15% of the tax base. Right. Some of that, again, ideological because of wealth taxes and things like that. But the point is, you won't fix the broader base by talking about the satellite taxes. This was the problem Rachel Reeves had. And that's why she basically broke the manifesto in the first budget and decided to raise national insurance. Oh, it's the employer's national insurance. Yeah, it is, Rachel, but it's still the cost of a worker. And the company still looks at a cost of a worker, whether it's going to HMRC or whether it's going to the worker. So That's why she had to do that, because there's no other place she could get 20, 25 billion quid from, right? These wealth taxes that say they'd raise 20 billion, Paul, they're just a fantasy, to be honest with you. So could we have a property tax? Maybe. It's probably a 10-year system to transition towards it. I'd suggest waiting until we've got AVMs we could hang our hat on. So we don't need 3,000 surveyors to give us the valuation of all of those properties, and doing it something like that. Stamp duty's a rubbish tax, mate, but we've got to think about it this way. When you look at, I've done these sort of meta-analyses of what do other countries do around the world? And people listening hopefully will be familiar with some of these. So Spain, France, for example, the notaries are very important in the transactions and getting paid handsome sums of money. Often the agents are taking 5 to 7%. So as much money or more leaves that transaction from between the buyer and the seller, right? It's just in this country, the government takes it all. In other countries, the private sector tends to take it all, and then the government gets money back through taxation. So they have the same barriers that we do in terms of blockages. I actually think, for any developers out there at the moment who are selling any houses, it's a great idea to pay people stamp duty. It's a haircut, but you can preserve the price. And because you can't borrow the stamp duty, so it gets in the way. And of course, it does have a knock-on effect because there aren't as many removal vans, there aren't as many estate agents, there aren't as many carpet fitters, there aren't as many new kitchens. It does impact GDP and the VAT take and things like that. So the probable way around it, if you want to generate some activity, is probably a stamp duty holiday, even though it's a horrible tax, because you can't bridge the gap between, if you started today, property tax, that sounds fair. It sounds good. How do we get from today's broken and horrible system to a functioning and progressive one with really significant difficulty over the period of a decade, with advanced AI involved, probably, Paul, to be honest with you. So I just don't see how it can be implemented.
Fine. That makes sense. There's a really interesting book by a guy called Dominic Frisby called Daylight Robbery, which is basically the history of taxation in the UK and like a forward-looking commentary on it. He makes a very interesting, compelling case for a land value tax, but the kicker is he says that's the only tax the government is allowed. So yes, you can introduce a land value tax, but you would have to abolish every other form of taxation. And he, I think, makes a good point about, is it fair to tax people's income? Because like if you've ever met a young person who's received their first salary slip at work and they come to you looking for an explanation as to what all these deductions are, it's a really difficult conversation. Particularly
I remember that feeling myself,
yeah,
absolutely.
particularly with the personal allowances that have been frozen for so long and now completely unrealistic. So
Yeah.
I've got a question on personal allowances, and then I'd be interested in, we'll just talk for a few, conscious of time, a few more wider points. Where do you think the personal allowance is going to go? Because obviously another party from the other side of the aisle a long time ago, I think suggested personal allowances of £20,000, which I thought that's one of the best ideas I've ever heard. Because if you think about it, 100% of that money will be spent on consumption. It's not invested in the stock market. It's not all the things that are possibly discouraged by the people who are introducing taxes. But if you give somebody the first £20,000, they're going to spend every penny off that. They're going to spend it on their rent, their mortgage if they have one, food, transport, clothing, and that's probably it. There's not like a luxury consumption element to that. That's like sustaining a life in the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm so glad you brought up the incidents of the system, because, again, the conversation is completely wrong. There's this wealth spite thing that goes on, led by maybe Gary Stevenson, probably these days, who is obsessed with talking about wealth taxes, even though he himself admits they're not the answer, right?
Mm.
And wouldn't raise that much money and might even lose the UK money one way or another. We've seen that in the private school VAT piece and the ideology behind all of that, right? They haven't, they've got fewer teachers than they had when they implemented it, and they've managed to close 30,000 private school places down. Well done, I suppose, if that's how you feel about it, but it's not a good result for anybody involved, realistically. And what I find fascinating about this conversation, and I totally agree with you about income tax, and I do agree that the whole tax wealth not work, they've got it wrong, right? Tax spending not work, right? Look at the VAT system, simplify it. VAT was supposed to be a simple tax, and the tax code is now 944 pages, I think, for VAT. It's a joke. There's far too many exemptions. There's far too many this, that, and the other. The only exemption I keep is on new build housing, and not because I'm a new build developer, but because adding 20% onto that would finish the sector off at the moment, right? But I would personally advocate for a luxury rate of VAT. Okay, so maybe VAT's at 30% for items that cost over X. Yeah. So £1,000, I'll come up with something. So that would make cars more expensive. It would raise inflation a tiny bit, but not a lot, because how many people who haven't got much money buy things that are over £1,000, right? And it may be the right number's £10,000, Paul. I haven't done the maths behind it, right? But the problem is, of course, this government is still hamstrung by the promises of the last government that they wouldn't touch VAT. So you'd be much better off to put more to, if you balanced out the personal allowance idea, which I do agree, one of reform's best policies, to be honest with you, but huge cost. I think it's 70 billion to raise the personal allowance from where it is, because everyone pays it who's got income. Like every full-time employee pays that tax between 12.5 and 20k, because a full-time minimum wager gets paid 24k these days. So to bridge that gap, we bring about 400 billion in income taxes each year compared to the 12 billion in stamp duty. So again, putting that into context, right? If we could take that down to 380 and bring an extra 20 billion in via VAT, via doing it that way and making it progressive, what's not to like about that? It's very, very Andy Burnham attitude towards things. Well, what's not to like is it breaks the manifesto. Ergo, call a bloody election and get on with it. I think not many people, if you think about how many, you see these things, 75% of people are in favour of a wealth tax, but you bring up Dominic Frisby. I'm sure in the book he points out in the early 1600s, when income taxes were first introduced, the pitch to the people was, don't worry, it's only the rich that are going to pay it. And then the scope creep since then has just been like this all the way through to now half of your taxable income, if you're on the minimum wage, is now taxed at the 20% level plus your employee's NI of 8% at the moment.
I think Dominic also makes the point that like almost every tax that's ever introduced is only a temporary measure until it isn't a temporary measure anymore. But there you go. Two final questions for you, conscious of time, and thank you so much for today. So much value. We've gone at a blistering pace, and I've gone through enormous more than I thought we would. So firstly, small business. So like the backbone of the UK is small, medium-sized businesses. A lot of people that listen to this podcast will have kind of businesses between 0 and 5 team members. Like, how should they navigate this future? Any words of advice, any top tips, any thoughts for small business owners?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a scary world at the moment, isn't it? Because things are moving so quickly. So vast majority of SME businesses I speak to on a day-to-day basis, Paul, one of the things they're worried about is AI, but primarily they're worried about whether they're using it adequately or correctly or not. The other thing is, I think the problem with business in general is that it's quite hard to pivot when you've been in it for some time, especially if you're very small, right? So, for example, I think leisure facilities are having a really tough time at the moment, primarily because of that disposable income point that you raised, right? So activities that used to work brilliantly, and it's like a fun tax. It takes the fun out because people can't afford to go out in the week anymore, right? So, but if you look at certain sectors, like wellness, for example, people seem to have an unlimited budget of what they'll spend on keeping themselves well. And there are so many influencers and different advices from different angles. So you might need to look at what is going to persist over the medium term, especially as AI starts to creep in, right? So I think those sorts of things are person focused. Experience centric businesses have been important for years, Amazon proof businesses, ideally. But wellness and health in general is just huge at the moment. So you might need to consider how you pivot or serve that sector, because you might be fighting a losing battle if you're running a string of gastropubs, let's say, for example, or one gastropub. So I know they're putting 20% off the business rates in the pub sector. Will that save them? I don't know. Realistically, where will that money go? We'll see. Some landlords will take that as an opportunity to raise the rent, I'm sure. Where the money goes in these situations, you have to be very, very cognizant of. But luckily, there is precedent for all of this stuff, so you can generally find out. But I think work out what you're going to do with AI. Use it to augment your people, not to replace them, right? You can do the bits you didn't have time to do before, or you couldn't do robustly enough before. Help it to train your staff, right? You can also build stuff, I wouldn't say relatively easily, but something that's going to be able to replicate the decisions that you would make if you use something like Claude. So if you're not stuck into Anthropic's Claude at the moment, go to it, talk to it, whatever you don't understand. I type into it all the time. Give me the idiot's guide, Claude, because I don't speak Python or whatever. I don't want to see the code, right? Just tell me what to do and why to do it, and then I'll question you back and forth. So use a bit more than you're already doing. Use it to build and help your people.
Awesome. Perfect. Final question, which is, it's interesting, the conversation around, number 10 in the north. So obviously you're based in the Midlands, I'm based in Yorkshire. Listeners to this podcast are all over, in fact, all over the world, and certainly all over the UK. What do you make of the kind of this, number 10 in the north conversation that's kind of started, pros and cons? I've seen, friends of mine, like London investors on LinkedIn, who I'm friends with, saying like it's the end of times, that he doesn't understand how London works. London is the epicenter of London, or, of the UK, and should London fail, the rest of us are. So give us some pros and cons of having, number 10 in the north.
Well, if you see it as part of the overall devolution agenda, which I think there's a little bit of tongue in cheek with it all, and the Manchesterism and all the rest of it,
Yeah.
but the devolution agenda has been important, and again across the political spectrum, for at least 15 years. Cameron and Osborne were on this bus, and they made a start with it, right? It's been derailed a bit by your Brexits and your COVIDs and your things like that. But overall, the idea of John Healey setting out these 5 priorities, including number 3, was buying British, right? You might be familiar with what they call the Preston model, Paul, which was piloted in Preston, of using the local authority to procure services that were provided within the local authority area. What a bloody great idea, because you're taking people's money and you're reinvesting it in the local businesses in the local community that will provide local jobs, that will let people have money to go to the coffee shops and everything up from there. The circular flow of income and the velocity of income. So again, sounds magnificent. Might be a bit inflationary when you go, well, it's costing twice as much because you're not buying it from China. That's why. So who's paying for that, and how does that work? Well, that needs some consideration. Of course it does. Interestingly, I've heard a perspective from people further up north or in Scotland saying, like, why does he think Manchester's north? I mean, it's the middle of the UK as we go, right? Geographically. So there's a little bit of people looking down from your Newcastles and above saying, not so sure about this, Mr. Burnham. I mean, look, I'd be very hopeful of things like better infrastructure east to west, Paul, because you mentioned about the Pennines earlier. We all know how much that desperately needs to go on. And there's some magnificent stuff going on up there. But I've invested over the years, for example, in places that have either put a new train station in or brought an old train station back to life. And it really transforms that micro economy because people can go into Nottingham, Leeds, Manchester and bring city wages home
Mhm.
instead of the suppressed little town wages that they've been dealing with. And again, that benefits the micro area. So I'm hopeful that as a symbolism of devolution, we collect 94% of our tax is collected centrally in this country, and it's just too much. I don't know about the end of times for London. I think we've got a terrible imbalance in this country between London being way over here as a really good global metropolitan city, and then even still today, Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds really lagging behind some pretty average cities in France and Germany and places like that we really shouldn't be behind, Paul. I mean, Leeds, for example, is an absolutely great city and it
Mhm.
should have more prosperity than it does. So hopefully, if they are sensible and procure locally, have we got enough competent politicians at the local authority level and officials at the local authority level? I'd love to say I've got some confidence in that, mate, but I don't really, to be honest with you. But we'll find out, won't we? We'll find out. And pretty much every sociologist or political commentator who talks on this subject suggests that devolution is a good idea. So I'm hoping they're right, mate, to be honest.
Well, you did tell us earlier that you're, and I to quote you, annoyingly optimistic, as am I. So let's both share in that annoying optimism. Look, Adam, this has been absolutely first class. Really appreciate all the value you've added. Absolutely spot on. I'm going to signpost people to your LinkedIn profile and to the Sunday supplement. It's a really highly regarded. Piece of analysis that comes out every weekend. Is there anything else you want me to signpost them to that I can pop in the show notes?
Sure, take a look at my YouTube as well, Proponomics with Adam Lawrence, if you haven't heard enough of my voice. And I'm sure Paul will be generous and share the footage, and we'll get some short clips done of all of this as well. But it's a pleasure collaborating with you again, Paul. Really enjoyed it. Brilliant questions as always. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Adam. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Please do like, subscribe, comment to the podcast on the podcast. Please do send it to a friend. Let's get this stuff out here. Thanks again, Adam, for joining us on the podcast. Thanks to the live audience as well. We're going to end the podcast now, and I'm going to turn over to the live audience. Thank you very much for listening. Keep well and speak soon.